Welcome back, 1570 AM Baltimore Positive WNST, and we are joined by our very own Luke Jones. And Luke, I can't wait for an update on the Liars Luncheon. I've been out of touch. I missed it, so I want to hear some great stories out of that event.
Wait a second, Dennis. I'm not going to lie. I thought you were going to ask me about something that was a little more on the up and up, like WrestleMania and pro wrestling.
Well, you know what? There's a story after that about an MMA event that got taped, and people were allowed to bet on it afterwards, which sounds a little bizarre. So yeah, there's a lot of great stories after we can talk about it. But yeah, let's talk about the Liars Luncheon. And it's one of it used to be one of my favorite events. It still is. I just didn't pay much attention to it so far.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not going to sit here and lie, Dennis. I don't think you missed a whole lot. As I wrote at BaltimorePositive.com in my 12 Ravens thoughts, kind of reacting to what we heard, what we didn't hear. I think if you've seen one Liars Luncheon, you've really seen them all.
You mean DaCosta didn't give you his draft card, his draft board? He didn't
right.
Get a picture of it?
Right. But in all seriousness, I think if there was one takeaway that I had, just in a general sense, Eric DaCosta, I'm not going to suggest he was unpleasant or anything like that. Let's be very clear before I say this. But, in past years, it's a little more lighthearted. In fact, I remember it was his first pre-draft press conference, which is what it technically is, what the technical name is, where he flat out said, "Welcome to the Liars Luncheon," back in 2019. He wasn't quite in that same kind of joking mood. And I think a lot of it is not that there is an urgency every single year, but the Ravens recognize, hey, coming off of an 8-9 season, lots of injuries that they're counting on guys to return from, lots of positions right now that they still need to address. I mean, as I wrote last week at BaltimorePositive.com, I think you could call the Ravens right now, they might be the ultimate half full, half empty team in the league that you could look at right now and say, okay, you'll talk about all of those different things. I mean, the fact that they were 8-3 before that 6-game losing streak that largely excluded the availability of Lamar Jackson and also Marlon Humphrey on the defensive side. But you can also point to a more half empty kind of perspective and say, okay, how many of those guys are going to come back from injury and be their old selves? What have the Ravens done in relation to other contenders in the AFC? I mean, my goodness, the latest being the Bills extending Stephon Diggs. I mean, it's just incredible. Not that that's an ad, but that's a solidification and another example of a team being very aggressive, trying to maximize its window before the heaviest numbers of that Josh Allen extension kick in. So, it's just and that's not to be doom and gloom. I just think it's a very fascinating perspective in kind of looking at how people view the Ravens. I think it's very easy to view them through a positive light, say, hey, they can bounce back and look how good they were in 2019 and 2020. And, you still have Lamar Jackson, and we know what that means. On the flip side, it is difficult, especially this time of year when you are looking around and, hey, the Ravens, relative to how they typically operate, they were more aggressive than usual in free agency, but still in comparison to some of the signings, some of the trades made elsewhere, and not at least wonder a little bit if maybe they've fallen behind a little bit at the very least. And again, the great equalizer in their minds, and this is something that Eric DaCosta reiterated during the press conference on Tuesday, was as long as he's in charge, the draft will continue to be their lifeblood, will continue to be their foundation. You're not going to see them go the route that the Rams have gone, although I think it's always fair, always wise to study what other teams are doing and maybe adapt your best practices a little bit. I think that should always be a moving target in any career field you're in. But reiterated that, hey, we're not going to completely change what we're doing just because we see other teams doing this, and ultimately time will tell. I think, as we look at this, clearly a great opportunity for the Ravens, 9 picks over the first 4 rounds. And let's face it, they need to hit. They need this to be a big draft. This needs to be a 2018 kind of draft. If the Ravens, if they care about style points, which I'm not saying style points are important in March and April, but come the fall, if you want to be regarded as one of those very top contenders in the AFC, hard not to look at this draft and say they need to come away with 2 or 3 guys that are going to give them some meaningful impact here in 2022, not just looking towards the future.
Now, look, they have 10 picks, though, but they have the roster to be able to absorb such a high number of picks? I mean, it's easy to see them trading. Somebody calls them for their 14th pick and offers them their own first and maybe a first or second next year. You can see them trading into next year. You can see them packaging picks to move up because they need quality just as much as they need quantity. But I just can't see them. I'm not sure anybody can absorbing 10 rookies plus undrafted free agents and everything else they have to address.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair question. At the same time, they had a lot of free agents, Dennis, and let's face it, they haven't re-signed that many of them to this point. Now, that's not to say you won't see a Josh Bynes come back, a Calais Campbell come back. I mean, you could see some group of those guys coming back. But another interesting takeaway, as much as so much of the Liars Luncheon is white noise. I mean, they love every prospect. They like every, they like every group of, position group, all of that. And that's the stuff that you don't really take much from. Sometimes they're telling you the truth. Sometimes they're lying, and trying to read those tea leaves is not easy. But I did find it interesting when Eric was kind of talking about expectations for this year's group. And of course, a lot of talk will be made, a lot of talk about the fourth round where they have those 5 picks. But he made a comment and said, any guy that we select in that fourth round, and certainly earlier than that, we have expectations that they're going to play. So with that in mind, and something else that he said, it's really tough for young guys to play and contribute if the opportunity isn't there. And a perfect example of that would be, what comes to mind for me, look at someone like Tyus Bowser. Look, his development was slow. I don't think it was only because he couldn't get on the field because there were veterans ahead of him. I think he had a lot of developing to still do. So I don't think it was exactly all about a lack of opportunity, but there is something to be said. And if there's one criticism you could look to as far as how the Ravens have managed their cap the last couple of years, that some people have pointed out, I don't know how much of it I buy. I think it can be true in certain instances, but they have depended on a lot of value veteran types, guys that are making $1.5 million, $2 million, $2.5. And the thing is, Dennis, that adds up, rather than if you eliminate a few of those guys from the equation, you count on some younger guys and guys on rookie contracts and completely making the minimum, all that, which is what the Rams have had to do, right? They've had a very top heavy roster. So they've had to count on a lot of late round picks and complete minimum type guys. There is a thought that if you do that, you save some cap space. Maybe you can go out and get another home run hitter or a triples hitter, let's say, and then some of those young guys that maybe had to wait their turn for a year or two, maybe they hit the field a little bit quicker. So I think it's an interesting thought, and that would be maybe the argument, in response to what you just said, that maybe they do lean a little bit leaner as it relates to depth and some of those positions where maybe they've leaned a little more on value free agents, which are great in isolation. But if you have so many value free agents, that's one big contract that you maybe can't give out to acquire a superstar, like we've seen some other teams do. So I think it's just some food for thought. Now, I don't think it's necessarily set in stone that's what they're going to do. But I did find it interesting hearing Eric DeCosta kind of talk about, the fact that he thinks there's going to be a little more opportunity than usual for some young guys to play. So one thing I will say, as much as that sounds great in April, it's a little bit of a different ball game when that comes to be reality come September and October. And I think inside linebacker is a great example of that, as far as where the Ravens have been. Go back to 2019 when that Owasso, Kenny Young group really struggled and they had to bring in Josh Bynes and LJ Fort. And even this past year where Patrick Queen and Malik Harrison weren't getting the job done. So they had to bring in Josh Bynes and make some changes there. So it'll be interesting to see just how much follow through there might be there. And maybe that would be that path for 9 or 10 draft picks potentially making your roster. But generally speaking, Dennis, I tend to agree with you. I think that's tough. At the same time, the Ravens did make a number of moves to acquire these picks, and Eric DeCosta made it very clear, Joe Ortiz as well, that this is a draft class that they felt good about even before last year's draft, kind of looking ahead, that they wanted to have those extra picks. So it'll be interesting. But I'm with you. If you have an opportunity that you can be aggressive If someone that you really like, whether it's a first round, second round, whenever it might be, falls a little bit further than you were anticipating, and you have a chance to move up a few spots to make sure you get your guy, by all means, do not worry about holding on to a fourth round pick in order to do something like that, where you can get a little more quality in addition to thinking about quantity.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I thought they would need maybe 8 out of their 10 draft picks this year for the defense. Looking at it a little bit deeper, I'm seeing they need offensive line help through the draft. They can use a move tight end. Mark Andrews, he's great. He gets hurt though. Who's going to get separation as a tight end? It's not going to be anyone on the roster currently, and even running back. You're talking about significant injuries for Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins. No guarantee they're going to be what they were. Never mind better this season. So to me, a running back, tight end in the 4th round makes sense. And certainly an offensive lineman much higher than that, 1st round or 2nd round for sure.
Yeah, and I hate to say it, Dennis, but your argument there's almost lends itself to maybe you do hold on to more of those picks, but because you do have a lot to address. I mean, they have a lot of needs, and not just like the most desperate needs, but I think like you mentioned, you wouldn't say that tight end is a massive need, but I would say that's something you really want, right? You wouldn't say a running back is a massive need, but it's something you'd really like, because chances are, if we kind of look at it, from a statistical probability standpoint, are Dobbins and Edwards both going to come back and be really effective this year? Or is the more likely outcome one of them really comes back and is effective, and the other guy, not to say he'll be a non-factor, but might lag a little more? It might be until week 13 that the other guy is really up to speed. So in the meantime, yeah, you'd like to have another running back in the mix. And, Justice Hill coming back from an Achilles as well. So, so you go down the list, they do have, if you want to say their needs and things that they'd really like to have, things that they'd really want to add, that's when you start to get into these numbers and you say, you know what, 9 picks in the first 4 rounds. Yeah, I could see them doing a little bit of maneuvering, but I almost think that they're going to need to make, that many picks. And, what it might just mean, Dennis. And, you look at this roster right now, you've got some value concerns. There's no question about it. I mean, Miles Boykin, there were already rumors of about a month ago about him being traded. Mm-hmm. I don't know if they're so hell-bent on saving face to get a conditional 7th round pick, or they're thinking they can get a swap of 6th round picks or something like that. I just don't know, but I have a tough time believing he's going to be on the team. To your point about the offensive line, depending on what happens there, Ben Powers, you look at that cap figure, if Ben Cleveland and Tyree Phillips are both, kind of earmarked to be in that competition for left guard. I think Powers is a value concern. I mean, you go down the list. I mean, there are definitely some moves you can make there to open up, 1, some cap space, 2, some roster spots. So maybe that does lend itself to being able to carry a little bit of a bigger draft class. But I'm with you, and it's good and it's bad, right? When you have that many positions that you can address, it does allow you to stay a little more true to best player available, right? On the flip side, when you do have that many needs to address, it does make you realize that you've got a football team that, is incredibly talented in certain areas, but there's also some concerns that do make you take a little more pause to say, okay, where exactly are the Ravens going to stack up in the division, and certainly in an AFC that, kind of across the board, other than I guess the AFC South, you look to and say, has gotten better. And you look at that wild card, if you're not winning the division, looking at that wild card situation and saying, wow, that's going to be a crowded field there jockeying for those 3 wild card spots.
Luke, since I missed the entire press conference, any good stories you can share with us? Any good takeaways that none of us were there to see?
You know what? I wish I could. And it's funny because I was talking to a couple other reporters, veteran reporters on the beat, guys I know really well. And, we share intel, we share perspectives. And, before we all go and write our stories or talk about it on the radio. And we were all saying it wasn't quite as anecdotal. I'll give you one. It's not an anecdote, but I just find it amazing because we just talked about how many different positions. I mean, you mentioned the offensive line. You could talk about center and left tackle as far as the developmental guy. Go down the list, running back, tight end. on the defensive side, the defensive line, outside linebacker, inside linebacker, corner we didn't even mention. But you know what the funniest takeaway was? And Joe Ortiz even acknowledged this when he did a few extra minutes with the media and just kind of a scrum as we were sitting around asking him some questions. For the first time, at least that I can remember, and I've been covering pre-draft press conferences. I think 2012 was my first one. And certainly I've followed the Ravens since their very beginning in 1996. So I'm sure maybe it's happened a couple times, but there was not a single question, Dennis, about the wide receiver position, which you just think about in the history of this organization, and I will also say, it's a good wide receiver class, and I wouldn't be opposed to a wide receiver, not in the first round per se, but as you get a little bit later into the draft, and as you're seeing, Dennis, these prices for wide receivers are going up. So I'm almost starting to think about wide receiver in the same way that you think about corner, where I'm almost thinking that you need to draft one at some point in the first 4 rounds almost every year, just to kind of keep a good enough churn that you don't pigeonhole yourself into a position where you're overpaying your wide receivers, which, I mean, Marquise Brown will be an example of that as far as how much is he going to fetch, after his 5th-year option. So, but yeah, no questions about wide receivers, which again does speak to how aggressive they've been drafting wide receivers the last couple of years. But I also think is a reflection of how many other bigger fish they have to fry in terms of this roster, because you tell me right now the Ravens take a wide receiver with one of those 4th-round picks, I don't bat an eyelash. I'm not remotely surprised by that if there's someone they like. So, but that was definitely funny, and believe me, that was not something that went unnoticed by the Ravens brass.
I hear you. So now we talking about wide receivers. They have Brown, they have Bateman, Prochet, Duvernay, and I've got to look at the depth chart to see who's left. As you mentioned, Boykin. Don't see him being there. Tylan Wallace. I forgot about Tylan Wallace. So yeah, I guess they have enough when you factor in the tight end group. And again, I'd be very surprised if they don't draft a tight end relatively high.
Yeah, and I think that's where you kind of look at, you kind of blur the line, right? I mean, Mark Andrews isn't the typical tight end, right? I mean, that's why when I hear people say, well, they only have Marquise Brown and you're hoping that Rashad Bateman takes the major jump, and I'll hear that. But, Mark Andrews is, he's a super tight end, right? I mean, it's the same way that you don't talk about the Kansas City Chiefs pass catching targets and wide receivers without mentioning Travis Kelce. I mean, that's George Kittle in San Francisco. I mean, it's just, he's in that tier now, however you want to rank them. But I still think that's that's still a position that they could point to. And maybe it lends itself with the idea of what you said. And I'm in agreement with you. I think you need to have better than Josh Oliver in terms of a potential understudy for Andrews. I mean, you're not going to draft another Mark Andrews. We know that, but you don't want it to be a case where Mark Andrews goes down and you have to completely change your offense because you don't have anyone who even tries to play like that. And I don't think Josh Oliver is that guy. So I'm with you in that sense. And I think if there's one thing you could point to at wide receiver to say, all right, maybe a guy that's a little bit taller, a bigger target, a red zone option, which that receiving minded tight end could fill that kind of need as well. So I think that's certainly something they could look to. But again, you look at all the other more pressing needs on this roster. It's a lot of work to do. And again, that kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning of our discussion, that seem to sense a little more urgency than normal from Eric DeCosta. But hey, guys like him and Joe Ortiz, I mean, this is their biggest chance to make their mark. As Ortiz said, scouts don't play games in the fall. The draft is their game. The pre-draft process is their game, and this is their chance to shine. So, they want their guys that they've been scouting and that they've identified and evaluated as being legitimate NFL talent. One, they want them to be drafted. Two, they certainly want them to succeed. And obviously, the first step of that comes, in just a couple weeks as we get to draft night.
Luke, great stuff as always. I appreciate you. Please tell our listeners all the great stuff you do for WNST Baltimore Positive, all your great work on your blog and everything else that you do.
Absolutely. I encourage everyone to follow us on Twitter at WNST. You can follow me personally at Baltimore Luke. Check out my blog at BaltimorePositive.com, sponsored by Coons Baltimore Ford. My latest 12 Ravens thoughts. Like I said, nothing profound coming from the Liars Luncheon, but I had some thoughts there. Some other things that we didn't necessarily cover in our conversation. I'll have more on the Orioles. Of course, opening day this week. Baseball season is back, ready or not. If you're an Orioles fan, probably going to be another long season, but still have some thoughts, some pertinent points to make as it relates to the rebuild in the big picture. You want to be on the WNST Baltimore Positive Text Service, sponsored by Coons Baltimore Ford. If it is another Ravens signing, which I'm expecting we'll still see a couple more here over these next few weeks as we get closer to draft night. Draft weekend, we'll text out each draft pick as long as it's not occurring at 11:45 at night or anything like that. But you want to be on the WNST Baltimore Positive Text Service, sponsored by Coons Baltimore Ford. Any significant local sports news sent directly to your mobile device. And of course, anything throughout the week on AM 1570 with Nestor. You can check out the Ravens Liars Luncheon, the pre-draft press conference. You can check out all of that at BaltimorePositive.com.
Excellent stuff as always, my friend. Keep doing great things, and I'm sure we'll talk more NFL draft as we approach, April 28th, I believe now.
Sounds good, Dennis. Be well. And yeah, it'll be here before you know it. Just 3 weeks away, less than 3 weeks away, as we're talking about this and people are listening. So definitely looking forward to it.
Can't wait for that. Stay well.
You too.
Thank you. There it goes, Luke Jones here on 1570 AM. WNST will take a quick break and come back right after this.